So if you take a look at the weather outside today, it's bright and sunny, absolutely glorious day. Now the big temptation of course is to stick on a dry fly and go for the fish that are coming up to the surface, but bear something in mind. Fish don't have eyelids. They don't like bright sunny days, and often what you'll find when you're fishing in these sort of conditions is that the fish are staying really deep down at the bottom of the river. Now, one of the most important patterns you can have for circumstances like that is something really natural like a caddis pattern. Pretty much every river you'll ever fish will be stuffed full of caddis. So this is my version of the Peeping Caddis, a fantastic pattern that can catch you a few really big fish. So let's get on with the tie. So a couple of things with this. The idea is that this fly is pretty heavy, and you can probably see in the vise I've got a size 12 hook, and the hook I've chosen is a Hanak 450 BL in size 12. Fantastic hook with a really nice wide gape and a mega sharp point. And let me tell you, there isn't anything swimming around out there that this thing can't handle. This is a pretty serious piece of ironmongery. But on it, I've got two beads. The first, the one that's mounted at the head, is a 3.5mm black anodized bead, 3.5 mils of tungsten, and then behind it is a plain tungsten 3mm bead. That's a countersunk bead, but I hope you can probably see that I've flipped that countersunk bead around so that the wide end, the end that you'd normally face in that direction, is facing up against the first bead. Now the reason for that is when I tie it in, I've got a tiny little diameter hole here that I can butt my thread up against, and the bead actually fits better against the bead on the head, so you get a neater finish. Tying materials, well, the thread is just a standard 8/0 olive Textream, and there are a couple of other processes that I'll talk about as I go through, but let's get on with the tie. As I say, caddis is really staple, isn't it? I mean, it's one of those things, along with things like gammarus and olives, pretty much in every single river. I'm just going to lay on a little bed of tying thread first of all to get us going. And what will happen as we go is that this bead will become securely kind of fastened against the one at the head. 6.5mm of tungsten on this hook. So you can imagine it gets down pretty fast, and that's really important because when you start to flip rocks over on the bottom of the river and start to look around, just going to straighten that up a wee bit, it's a little bit wonky, you'll start to notice that the caddis are always under the rocks, and I'm sure you've seen that when you've dislodged rocks and had a little look underneath. That's where they live, so that's where we want to try to put the natural food items, so the fish, the trout and the grayling are used to seeing them there. Okay, now one interesting thing with this is that I'm going to be putting a Peeping Caddis tail on it, and often you can do that with some glow bright thread, no problem with that, or various other bits and pieces that look bright green. If you've seen the actual insect outside of its case, it's really quite green and very brightly coloured. This is something that I have used in the past for the tail, so glow bright. This one's number 12. So very brightly coloured green. You can make a little tag out of that. But I've actually got slightly lucky with something. A mate of mine runs a company called Palatrax, and Palatrax make lots of coarse fishing equipment, and they've just brought out these really interesting hooks, which are treble hooks designed for predator fishing. They're barbless, or rather they're not actually barbless, they're called grips, so they've got this spangly kind of design where although they're not barbed hooks, they've got a sort of a really interesting point on them that makes them easier to take out of fish when you hook them. But you'll notice on the end of those hooks there is a green thingy. Now I don't know what it's actually called other than a green thingy, but they're little rubber stoppers, and they come off the end of the hooks, and guess what? They make the very thing that you need to make a Peeping Caddis tail, or head rather should I say. And what I've done using my threader is I've taken off one of those little rubber thingies, highly technical, and I've attached it to my threader like so. So I've just kind of pushed a needle through the centre of that, and I've managed to just thread that onto the threader there so that I can attach it to my hook. Before I do that, I'm going to grab a piece of really thick mono. This is brightly coloured. Obviously it doesn't have to be. I mean, this is orange because it's the thickest bit of line I had in my drawer, but actually it doesn't have to be any particular colour. And I'm going to attach the little green thingy to this piece of line. So without further ado, let's have a little go at that. So first things first, grab the threader, poke the line through the diamond eye, and then I'm just going to slide the green thingy onto the line, like so. Job done. Really easy. The next part of this is to slide that piece of green rubber all the way down to the kind of last couple of centimetres of that piece of mono. And then I'm going to grab my lighter. This is one of those turbo flame ones, and to be honest, it makes a fantastic noise. It's one of my favourite things about it. Listen to this. That's got to do some damage, hasn't it? I love it. But anyway, just going to melt the end of that piece of mono. And you can probably see a little flame comes out, like so. Got to be a bit careful not to melt the green beady thing, because this lighter is a serious piece of kit, as you can probably hear. That'll do us. Now, with that line still kind of a little bit melty, you can sort of squidge the rubber beady thing. It's all highly technical, this, you know, onto the end of that piece of monofilament. Now what that then allows you to do is, because I've now mounted that onto there, I can now tie that onto my hook as if it's a tag. I just really like the colour of it, and I mean, there is no reason not to use the glow bright, but I just really like this as a presentation. It's something a little bit different. So now all I'm going to do is introduce that to the top of the hook and just use thread wraps to attach it to the top, and it needs to be sort of butted up to the end like so, and then just kind of fasten it down to the top of the hook. Take a turn underneath as usual. Just kind of make sure it's nice and secure. And then I'm going to use an old pair of scissors, because this is pretty meaty old monofilament. It's actually, I reckon that's about 0.30 in diameter, so serious line. I'm just going to secure everything nicely down. The rest of this tie is pretty simple. That's probably the most tricky bit. All I'm going to do now is I'm going to create like a soft hackle at the end, and I'm going to use some partridge feather. This is Vineyard's Just an English partridge grey neck one, and I'm going to just use the very tips of it to just create that feeling of an insect kind of trying to crawl out from inside that, basically the case that you're going to create here. So grab a partridge feather like so. That's quite a little one, which is good. And I'm going to strip off all the fluffy bits. And I just want to use the sort of the very end bit, so I don't want loads of stuff coming out of the end, because it starts to look really untidy. That's not what I'm going for here. I'll show you in a second as I'm doing it. I mean, this is one of those patterns that really is quite a good big fish catcher too. I've used it actually with a lot of success on big grayling. So you can see there, look, I've just stripped off quite a lot of the fibres. I'm just going to take my hackle pliers. I'm going to pinch the end of that feather just on the stalk, and then with my other hand I'm just going to brush away those fibres like so, so you get kind of like a little aeroplane shape. And then take my hackle pliers away, introduce it to the back of the hook, and just catch in that little triangle, leaving the other bits poking out. In fact, actually I'm going to just move it back a little bit on the hook because they're a little bit long. So kind of halfway down for this one. You'll see why in a second, because they'll kind of splay out, and I don't want them to be too long. I'm just going to trim off that excess bit of partridge there. Again, back to the hackle pliers, grab hold of the stem and just give it a little bit of a wind around the hook so they start to ping out like so. Just a couple of turns is enough. Use my tying thread to catch it down. I know this looks really untidy at the moment, and I'm just going to make sure that everything folds back in the right direction. So you can see it just pinged out there. I just have my thread a little bit too far away. Just going to go a bit closer. Put my thread stem there and catch it into the shank of the hook. And trim off. And then what I can do is just brush back with my fingers so that those partridge feather bits start to poke out over the top of my little green thingy. As I say, all very highly technical. Like so. So you kind of get almost like a claw of the partridge. Just going back over the top of that little green bit. Just try and make it look like it's a living creature crawling around on the riverbed. I mean, if you've actually seen some of these caddis, they are pretty fearsome looking beasts, and like a lot of things, if you actually saw them in a great big size, they'd be terrifying kind of alien creatures. Anyway, there we go. So next thing that's going in, just a bit of rib to just hold everything together, and I'm just using a copper wire for this. Played with a few other colours. I actually don't think it matters too much. I'm just going to use that to hold all my dubbing together, which will be going on in a minute. Now the next stage I would say is quite important in terms of coloration. I think it's really important to start flipping a few of those rocks over as you start to go on the bed of your local river, because what the caddis do is they gather up all the kind of stones and sticks and bits of detritus to make their case. So for me, it stands to reason that if you are going to tie something that's supposed to be imitative of something that lives on the bed of the river, you need to find material that looks like the bed of the river you're fishing. And what we find in competition fishing, for example, I know a few anglers who'll go through, they'll wade through the bit of river they're fishing, they'll actually take their boot off and empty the sandy contents of it into a little tray so they can actually examine what colour those bits and pieces of gravel and little sticks and stuff that the caddis make their real cases out of. And then they'll create their fly based around the colour of that detritus. So, on my local river, the Meon we're talking about here, the bed is very grey. It's got this weird sort of bed actually. It's not gravel as such. I mean, there are some gravel patches, but an awful lot of it has got this almost kind of grey sludgy stuff underneath, almost like I think it's a bit of a throwback from years ago when there used to be some iron production around in the area. Maybe it's something to do with that. I don't actually know. There's an immense amount of bug life in the river. And one of the things we find is that the caddis make their cases out of stuff that's fairly grey. So I'm actually using this stuff. This is Trout Stalker dubbing, one of my favourites. And this is a boosted natural. So it's kind of hare's eary, but it's got some sort of fairly grey fibres in it. So I'm just going to take a biggish pinch of that because the body of this does need to be fairly bulky. And I'm just going to dub it on. Sometimes when I'm doing this sort of stuff, I find it quite useful to just lick the end of my fingers. And it just helps you to, when you twist the dubbing onto the thread, it just helps it to kind of bind on itself. And then I'm going to slide it up. And as usual, just slide those fibres of partridge out the way and form a nice caddisy body, like so. Now the challenge I've got here, of course, is that I've got to cover up this second bead, and I can do that with a decent pinch of my dubbing. Perhaps not quite that decent, that was a little bit too much, but we'll get there in the end. Again, slide it up, and what I'll do then is I'll make my first wrap over the head of the fly and my second backwards. So I'm actually stretching it at a kind of 45-degree angle over the back of that plain bead, and then the second one comes back in the other direction. And that just helps you, whoops, just to cover up that bead. Like so, just check. We've got the bottom is uncovered. Don't worry too much about this, because once you've managed to get enough dubbing on there, it will cover it up nice and neatly. And you can already see it looks quite insecty, doesn't it? There you go, just see the bottom's getting nicely covered up. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my copper wire and I'm going to bring my rib up. Four, 5 turns, and then right at the head. It's quite thick wire this because I want it to be fairly sturdy. Just shorten my thread down and catch it all in at the head, like so. Trim off with an old pair of scissors. Now, I have played in the past with putting other bits of dubbing at the head, some, you know, Spectra Flash or something like that, but to be completely honest, it really doesn't need it. I mean, that to me looks like it could be a real insect and it could actually crawl off. Certainly something could crawl out of there and disappear off the sort of tendril bits coming out, and it starts to look alive. And if you fish that as a single nymph or as the point fly in a cast with a couple of other heavy flies, that will bomb the rest of your cast right down to the riverbed and get you into a position where sometimes you'll find some really big fish. As I say, often on quite bright sunny days where fish haven't got eyelids and can't cope with bright sunshine, so they'll be sitting quite deep and feeding right on the bottom. So there you go, that's my version of the Peeping Caddis. Once again, thanks ever so much for watching the video. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you get on okay with it. If you can't get hold of these thingies, as I call them, the little green thingies, don't fret, just use some Glow Bright or some yarn or something like that, something with a bright colour. Maybe play with a couple of different colours actually, you know, rather than doing green, tie a red one or something like that. It's often so much the profile of these flies rather than the colour that will get you takes. But yeah, have a little go and hopefully it will catch you 1 or 2 fish. Thanks ever so much for watching. Remember, if you've enjoyed the video, give us a big old thumbs up, will you? And also maybe hit the subscribe button, because it does help us to put together films that I know you like watching. So thanks again, and see you very soon.